Today, President Volodymyr Zelensky is visiting France. Tomorrow, he'll be meeting German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Obviously, one of the reasons he's meeting both of these leaders is to try and put some new blood into the Normandy process, which brings together France, Germany, Russia, Ukraine, and through that, the so-called Minsk peace process, which hasn't really gone very far since the second Minsk peace agreement was signed in February of 2015, so over 4 years ago. I think that President Zelensky has good intentions, and we understand, war is nothing to support. Just this month, 8 Ukrainian soldiers and far higher number were wounded. So 8 soldiers killed, about 25 wounded just this month. But I think that Volodymyr Zelensky is whistling in the wind if he thinks that somehow he can bring a better touch and he can somehow lead to a breakthrough in the peace process that his predecessor could not. Now, this is not that unusual for new guys coming into power to say, look, I'm going to do better than the previous one. Donald Trump ridicules everything that Barack Obama did. Barack Obama, in turn, ridiculed everything that George Bush did. And the same goes with other Ukrainian leaders. In this sense, Zelensky ridiculing Poroshenko very much reminds me of Leonid Kuchma ridiculing Leonid Kravchuk back in 1994. The Russian speaker from Eastern Ukraine will do wonders which the nationalist, whether it's Kravchuk or Poroshenko, could not. I don't think that's going to be the case, and certainly all of the Siloviki, the members of the different security forces I met during my June visit to the front line, all believe that the war will continue. None of them believe in any kind of likely peace process. And that's not surprising because they're under attack on a daily basis. Last time I was in the war zone was in March and May of 2016, so approximately just over 3 years ago. You notice the greater amount of destruction of buildings and property on the front line. So the Botivka mine, which is at a very crucial kind of conflict zone in the village of Avdiivka, the mine there is far more destroyed today than it was even in 2016. So that use of heavy weaponry, which you're not supposed to use under the Minsk agreement, these are supposed to be pulled back behind lines, are obviously continuing to be used. What you noticed compared to 2016, and I guess 2015, 2016 was that transition period to the beginnings of a new Ukrainian army. In 2015, all of the volunteer battalions were integrated into the military and National Guard. And so you had the beginning of the formation of a Ukrainian army. Today, there's no question that the army exists. You can tell this just by looking at the way soldiers look. In 2015, 2016, they would wear different uniforms depending on where they got them. If they begged, borrowed, or stole them, they'd wear different footwear. Today, it's standardized, and they look very professional, and they look very Western in the way they look and the way they present themselves. So I think that certainly shows that training and greater degree of professionalism on the Ukrainian side. Besides soldiers, the main soldiers I saw were from the 93rd Brigade, which is based in the town of Cherkass in Dnipro Oblast. It's a very large mechanized division. As I also saw police special forces, which were members of former volunteer battalions, which have been integrated into the police and acted as the kind of units that, for example, did most of the work in the blockades, on the road blockades that you get everywhere as you're driving round. And I also went to the right sector, the Duk, as they call themselves, Duk Pravi sector. This is the only volunteer battalion that refused to be integrated into the official structures. Everybody knows where it is, so including, I'm sure, the security service and the Russian security service. They can't hide the fact that what they're doing, but they often are very active in the field in doing things that maybe the military can't do under the Minsk agreements. So those are three I saw. One observation is that there's a large number of soldiers who are from the Donbas itself. So we should, move beyond this sort of stereotype that somehow everybody in the Donbas were either Russian speakers, separatists, pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian. I met a whole range of, and as I did previously, people from the Donbas, including from younger soldiers and officers to even a 58-year-old man from Luhansk Oblast, who was fighting for Ukraine right on the front lines. So I don't think it was true to say that Donbas was one way or the other. It was certainly split, but certainly a lot of people in Donbas are patriotic Ukrainians. One thing you don't see is many people from Crimea. And I think here it's a mistake, therefore, to compare Donbas and Crimea. In that sense, Crimea is more, or was more, pro-Russian, whereas Donbas was more typically like Eastern Ukrainian. You had pro-Russian, but you also had many pro-Ukrainian. And it's rare to meet a soldier who originally is from the Crimea. The other question I asked everywhere is the war, is the best way to describe the war a civil war? Because this is, of course, the official position of Moscow, official position of President Putin, which makes it extremely difficult for any Ukrainian leader to negotiate with Russia when Russia says we're not involved. And the whole bizarre nature of the Normandy format and the Minsk peace agreements was that Russia was sat at the table negotiating peace whilst at the same time involved in the war. I mean, that is absolutely ludicrous. So the official position of Moscow is that we're not there on the ground, we're not supplying weapons. These weapons have been stolen from Ukrainian forces by the so-called separatists or Russian proxies, and this is a conflict between Ukrainian and Russian speakers. Now, sadly, this kind of position is often repeated. It's garbage. This garbage is repeated by Western books, particularly by scholars writing on the left of the political spectrum, whether it's Canadian, British, American, even some Russian ones. This book, for example, I've just finished reading, regurgitates this garbage ad infinitum. You have a mixture of Western and Russian, very left-wing, neo-Marxist scholars writing on the conflict. It's all a civil war. Well, if that's the case, how come 80% at least of the soldiers I met, including the police special forces, were all Russian speakers? This kind of garbage about a civil war is propounded by people who have never been to the front line, who are just writing about it through their ideological prism, about Ukrainian fascists in power, about Russian language speakers being suppressed, and yet the majority of the soldiers from the 93rd Brigade I met were from Dnipro, Zaporizhia, and Kharkiv. So these are not West Ukrainians. These are not fascists. They understood Ukrainian, but their first language was Russian. You also get a lot of people who are of mixed descent. They have Russian, Ukrainian backgrounds. You get quite interesting characters who were born outside of Ukraine in other parts of the Soviet Union and then moved to Ukraine in the 1990s. One of the police special forces officers was born in Kazakhstan. His parents are German and Russian. So theoretically, he could emigrate to Germany because most of the Germans who've moved to Germany in the 1990s have come from Kazakhstan. These were Germans who were deported by Stalin in the 1930s and 40s. And he's fighting for Ukraine. When you always ask these people, why are you fighting for Ukraine? What do you think of the Western scholars saying this, or Russia saying this, that this is a civil war between Ukrainian and Russian speakers? They all look at you as though you're asking a really stupid, dumb question. It's kind of the case that it feels like that the only people who think there's a problem with language issues in Ukraine are people in Moscow and Western academics. Because in Ukraine, you just don't get it. There isn't that kind of issue. It's not an issue that people think is an issue. And it's certainly not on the front lines. The highest casualty rates of Ukrainian security forces are from the oblast of Dnipropetrovsk, Dnipro now, 4 times higher than any other oblast of Ukraine. And the idea that somehow this is just West Ukrainians fighting is simply wrong. Nobody thinks that the war will end soon, so they don't have any real confidence in President Zelensky moving the peace process forward, particularly because Moscow is not really willing to compromise. You don't just sign up to a peace process with Moscow. You have to sign up to what Moscow is demanding, which is a whole package of things, which includes basically federalization of Ukraine, special status in the Ukrainian constitution for the DNR, LNR, the so-called Russian proxy states, and their ability to veto policies in Kiev, and then the neutrality or Finlandization of Ukraine and its turning away from NATO and EU membership objectives. Now, for any Ukrainian president, except maybe Yuri Boyko from the opposition bloc, these are simply steps going too far. So when you talk to the soldiers and other people on the ground, they are concerned, particularly, shall we say, the more patriotic ones, they're concerned about what will Volodymyr Zelensky do, or which steps he will take. But at the same time, they're not very optimistic that this will go anywhere. The 15% of Ukrainians who are willing to have peace at any price, that is, they don't care what we have to sign as long as there's peace, are most undoubtedly, they have to be probably the voters who support Yuri Boyko and the opposition bloc, whether in the presidential elections and in the coming up parliamentary elections. But 60 to 70% of Ukrainians refuse the kind of demands that Moscow is making for which peace is possible. And certainly there's been a consistent 70% of Ukrainians, as I saw amongst the soldiers, who refuse this idea of let us recognize Russian sovereignty over the Crimea in return for some kind of Russian peace process in the Donbas of eastern Ukraine. Nobody believes Russia will be truthful on that. Plus, no Ukrainian president has the constitutional right to give away territory. Where is it in the constitution for him to do that? And no Ukrainian polls would allow him to that. So I think that the soldiers on the front line, although they're now much better equipped, understand that they will be there for quite a long time. But what this means is that there's going to be particularly continued deaths on the Ukrainian side. I've mentioned that there have been 8 Ukrainian soldiers killed this month, many more wounded. But on the other side as well, the so-called separatist forces, the locals and the Russian nationalist mercenaries that come to fight for them, for the DNR and LNR, these are basically cannon fodder for Russian forces who are controlling them, and they are standing behind the lines, as it were. So the first line of attack against Ukrainian forces are these local separatists with their Russian nationalist mercenaries, and then the Russian, particularly Russian military intelligence, are behind the scenes, behind the lines, as it were, backing them up and doing maybe special work. You can easily see this because in the bunkers all the way along the Ukrainian lines, there is a technical equipment, often provided by volunteers, by the way, which is able to look over into separatist lines, and they can watch them as they're being active, and they can watch them as they call curators, their bosses, which are usually Russian officers, are coming up and, as it were, telling them what to do. So the kill rate, unfortunately, Ukrainian TV does not do a good job. It only really talks about the high numbers of Ukrainian soldiers killed on a daily or monthly basis. Doesn't really talk about casualties on the other side, which are most likely, from everything I heard, going to be a lot higher. And that, sadly, will continue. And the more bloodshed you have in a war or a conflict, the more difficult it is for that conflict to be resolved. So we'll see where the negotiations or the revamped negotiations will take us on both the French and German side. I'm not very optimistic myself, but at least we know that one thing has happened in the last 5 years. Ukraine built its first ever really powerful army, and that army is doing a very good job in protecting Ukraine from Russian military aggression. Thank you.